It was supposed to be a peaceful journey for Naomi, a successful black businesswoman, as she boarded a first-class flight to celebrate her hard-earned success. But the disrespect she'd faced from the crew and passengers was beyond belief. Just when you think it couldn't get worse, Naomi decides to show them all exactly who she is. Watch until the end to see how this story unfolds. And don't forget to like, subscribe, and share your thoughts in the comments below. Naomi Wallace, a distinguished and self-made businesswoman, reclined in her seat in the airport lounge, savoring the quiet moment before her long flight. She was on the brink of something she had envisioned for years, a well-deserved vacation after months of intense work. For her, this trip wasn't merely a journey. It was a celebration of her hard work, perseverance, and a successful year that had propelled her business to new heights. She chose to fly first class, treating herself to a level of comfort and luxury that matched her accomplishments. As she boarded the aircraft, she was dressed impeccably, exuding confidence. Her head was held high, her dark braided hair falling gracefully over her shoulders, a symbol of both her heritage and her individuality. Her gaze remained calm and steady as she entered the first-class cabin. She had been anticipating the quiet luxury and refined comfort that flying first class promised. But as her eyes scanned the opulent seats, arranged in a way that ensured each passenger's privacy, she noticed subtle glances cast her way. The other passengers, many of whom were dressed in sharp business attire and fine luxury brands, did not hide their expressions. She caught the barely concealed surprise, the faint expressions of disdain, and even an occasional disapproving stare. A man in a sharply tailored suit cleared his throat loudly, glancing at her over the top of his reading glasses. An older woman clutched her designer handbag a bit tighter, looking Naomi up and down, her lips pressed tightly together in disapproval. Naomi held her composure, not reacting to any of it outwardly. She had dealt with these kinds of looks before and had learned long ago to rise above them. The flight attendants were busy helping passengers find their seats, adjusting luggage compartments, and offering a welcome glass of champagne. As Naomi settled into her seat, she noticed that the attendant who greeted her had a slight edge to her tone. Polite, but cold, almost rehearsed. It was a stark contrast to the warmth she observed in their interactions with the other passengers. When Naomi requested a bottle of water, the flight attendant hesitated slightly. Her response clipped as if the request were somehow inconvenient. Yet Naomi decided to brush it off. She wasn't here to focus on minor discomforts. She wanted to enjoy her journey. However, as the minutes passed, she noticed that even simple gestures of courtesy extended to the other passengers were withheld from her. For instance, when the flight attendant made her rounds, she stopped to chat and joke with the other passengers, yet merely nodded curtly in Naomi's direction. The subtle slights continued to accumulate, and though Naomi tried to remain calm, she felt a spark of frustration. She wanted to believe that she was overthinking it, but the dismissive attitude from both the crew and other passengers seemed too deliberate to ignore. As she reclined in her plush seat, Naomi couldn't help but think back to the obstacles she had overcome. She remembered the early days of her business, facing financial hardships and countless rejections. She had grown her business from the ground up, fueled by a drive that many couldn't even begin to fathom. Success didn't come easily for her, and she was no stranger to judgment or people's assumptions based on her appearance. She knew the struggles of breaking through barriers that weren't meant to accommodate her, a black woman striving for success in a world that often expected her to fail. And yet, here she was, triumphant and undeterred. But tonight, on what was supposed to be a well-earned break, she found herself once again dealing with the same old stares and judgments. She shifted uncomfortably in her seat, glancing around at the rows of passengers who were too wrapped up in their own privilege to see the woman beside them as their equal. The attendant's voice over the intercom announced that the plane would soon be taken off. As the engines roared to life, Naomi leaned back, taking a deep breath, willing herself to let go of the negativity around her. She reminded herself that she was here for herself, to enjoy the fruits of her labor, and that she wouldn't let anyone take that away from her. The seat was hers, the space was hers, and she had every right to occupy it. For a few moments, she succeeded in sinking into the luxurious feel of the seat, her mind beginning to wander into thoughts of her upcoming vacation, the beautiful sights she'd see, the exquisite meals she'd try, and the relaxation she so desperately needed. But just as she was beginning to find a moment of peace, a voice from across the aisle broke through her thoughts. "That's unusual," the voice murmured, followed by a low chuckle. Naomi glanced over and saw a middle-aged man, impeccably dressed in a dark suit, his eyes fixed on her as he spoke to the woman beside him. The woman nodded, her gaze shifting to Naomi for a fleeting second, her face a mixture of surprise and mild disdain. They were talking about her. She could feel it in the way their eyes darted to her and then back to each other, their expressions stiff and disapproving. Her fingers gripped the armrest tightly, fighting back the urge to confront them. She had worked so hard to get here, and she wasn't about to let anyone ruin her peace. But the weight of their stares, combined with the cold treatment from the flight staff, gnawed at her composure. It was as if they wanted her to feel out of place, to be reminded that, in their eyes, she didn't belong. Determined to not let her emotions take control, she closed her eyes, trying to breathe deeply and calm herself. Yet each time she tried to relax, a new slight seemed to find her. The attendant passed by again, this time serving another round of drinks to the passengers, all except her. The small gestures, the averted gazes, the quiet whispers, each one was a reminder of the undercurrent of hostility around her. She felt isolated, trapped in an environment where her accomplishments, her success, and even her right to be there seemed invisible. As the flight continued, Naomi struggled to keep her focus on her own thoughts, ignoring the whispered conversations around her. But the emotions were building, her patience slowly wearing thin. She felt as though she were on display, a target for judgment simply because of who she was. Despite her best efforts, the stifling tension around her was undeniable, and she knew that her journey would be far from the relaxing escape she had imagined. The plane was now in full flight, the cabin lights dimmed, and the hum of the engines filling the silence. Naomi attempted to relax once more, but her mind remained unsettled, weighed down by the hostility surrounding her. She promised herself that she would maintain her composure, that she wouldn't give anyone the satisfaction of seeing her discomfort. She had learned resilience in the face of worse treatment than this, but still, the sting of prejudice was one she could never fully ignore. And as the flight continued, Naomi could sense that this journey would be a test of her patience, a reminder of the battles she thought she had left behind but still found waiting for her, even at 30,000 feet above the ground. Naomi tried to maintain her composure as the flight continued, but the hostile atmosphere around her was difficult to ignore. She had dealt with prejudice before, but being in this enclosed space, with no way to escape the disdainful glances and whispers, was testing her patience in a way she hadn't anticipated. Every interaction seemed to carry an undertone of resentment, as if she were somehow intruding on a space reserved for others. A few hours into the flight, Naomi pressed the button on her seat to signal for the attendant, intending to request a glass of water. She hadn't had a drink since boarding, and the dry cabin air was starting to make her feel uncomfortable. After a few moments, the flight attendant approached her seat, her expression professional but devoid of warmth. "Yes?" the attendant asked, her tone flat. Naomi met her gaze calmly. "Could I please have a glass of water?" The attendant nodded curtly, but there was no acknowledgement beyond that, no polite smile, not even the usual "of course" that Naomi had overheard her saying to other passengers. The attendant walked away without another word, leaving Naomi with a feeling of emptiness that lingered long after she was gone. It wasn't that she needed the attendant to go out of her way to make her feel welcome, but the difference in treatment was palpable, unmistakable. A few minutes later, the attendant returned with a glass of water, setting it down on Naomi's tray without looking at her. She placed it with a slight thud, the glass almost tipping over, and then she walked away before Naomi could say anything. The message was clear. She was being tolerated, not welcomed. Naomi's fingers tightened around the glass, her jaw clenching as she took a sip. She willed herself to remain calm, not wanting to give the attendant or any of the nearby passengers the satisfaction of seeing her affected. However, as the flight wore on, it became increasingly difficult to ignore the isolation she felt. The other passengers exchanged friendly smiles and engaged in quiet conversations, the attendants moving seamlessly among them with polite smiles and attentive service. But Naomi remained on the outskirts, alone and ignored. She had longed for peace on this flight, a chance to unwind after months of hard work, but all she felt now was a growing tension. As the plane cruised through the night sky, Naomi shifted in her seat, unable to find a comfortable position. Her mind raced with memories of the struggles she had faced, of the countless times she had been made to feel like an outsider in spaces where she had every right to be. It was a feeling that no amount of success or accomplishment seemed to erase. Despite her frustration, Naomi managed to settle back, determined to let the incident pass. She had come too far to allow the ignorant behavior of a few individuals to ruin her well-deserved break. She put on her headphones, hoping that a bit of music would soothe her nerves, and closed her eyes, trying to focus on the good that awaited her at her destination. But her attempt at peace was soon interrupted. She felt a nudge on her armrest and opened her eyes to see a man in the aisle seat next to her, leaning across as he retrieved his bag from under the seat. His elbow brushed against her arm without an apology or even a glance in her direction. He settled back into his seat with a huff, his eyes narrowing slightly as he looked her way. Naomi chose not to react, though she could feel her patience thinning. She shifted slightly, giving him space, and returned to her thoughts, hoping that ignoring him would discourage any further interaction. But her hopes were short-lived, as the man, seeming to sense her discomfort, leaned slightly toward her, lowering his voice in a tone that was somehow both casual and dripping with disdain. "Must be nice to get a seat here," he murmured, just loud enough for her to hear. Naomi's eyes snapped open, and she met his gaze, surprised by his boldness. She had expected the subtle glances and silent judgments, but to hear it spoken so openly was jarring. She kept her voice calm, masking her irritation as best she could. "I don't understand what you mean," she replied, keeping her tone steady. He smirked, folding his arms as he settled back into his seat. "Oh, nothing. Just that, well, usually it's a certain type of crowd here, you know." Naomi's stomach tightened. She knew exactly what he was insinuating, but she had no intention of dignifying his ignorance with a reaction. She held his gaze for a moment longer, her expression unreadable, before turning away. She wasn't here to educate him, and she certainly wasn't here to defend her presence in a seat she had every right to occupy. The man chuckled quietly to himself, clearly satisfied with her silence, as if he had won some unspoken battle. Naomi closed her eyes again, her jaw clenched and focused on her breathing, trying to calm the storm of emotions building inside her. As if on cue, the flight attendant reappeared, moving through the cabin with the drink cart. Naomi watched as she poured champagne for each passenger, engaging them in light conversation, her demeanor friendly and attentive. But when she reached Naomi's row, the warmth faded from her expression, replaced by the same cold professionalism Naomi had encountered earlier. "Would you like something to drink?" the attendant asked, her tone devoid of any friendliness. Naomi considered declining, but she was thirsty and decided to accept. "Yes, please," she replied, her voice steady. The attendant poured her a glass, setting it down with a clink that felt deliberately careless, and moved on without another word. Naomi took a sip, trying to savor the drink despite the bitter aftertaste of the attendant's indifference. Throughout the next hour, the interactions only grew more unbearable. It was as though the entire cabin had silently agreed that Naomi was an intruder, a guest who had somehow snuck into a place she didn't belong. The other passengers continued to share quiet, knowing glances, their expressions full of judgment and condescension. Naomi was used to fighting for her place in the world, but here, in this confined space, she felt helpless, as though no amount of resilience could shield her from the collective disdain directed at her. Just when she thought she could bear no more, another slight from the attendant, another cold glance from a passenger, Naomi began to feel the edges of her patience fraying. She had endured enough, swallowed enough pride to fill the entire cabin. Her silence, her attempt to stay calm, felt increasingly futile in the face of such blatant prejudice. As the lights dimmed and the flight continued its quiet, steady journey through the night, Naomi wrestled with her emotions, torn between anger and a desperate desire to escape. She didn't know how much longer she could maintain her composure, but one thing was certain. This journey, meant to be a celebration of her accomplishments, had become a painful reminder of the battles she still had to fight. With every minute that passed, she felt the weight of their stares pressing down on her, each one a reminder that, in their eyes, she didn't belong. And yet, Naomi refused to let them see her break. She would hold her head high, meet their gazes, and remind herself that she had earned her place here, that no one could take that from her. But as the night wore on, she knew that the real test of her strength was only just beginning. As the hours drifted by, Naomi became painfully aware of the mounting discomfort in the cabin. The hum of the engines was a backdrop to the quiet chatter around her, the calm murmurs of first-class passengers settling in, ordering drinks, and perusing menus. Each interaction felt like another reminder that she was viewed as an outsider in this space, a curiosity that people would rather ignore but couldn't help but stare at. The dinner service was announced, and Naomi took a deep breath, steeling herself. She hoped this would be a moment of calm, a chance to enjoy her meal without having to deal with the judgmental looks and condescending tones that had plagued her since she boarded. But as the attendant began to distribute menus, she couldn't shake the feeling that her patience was about to be tested yet again. One by one, the passengers around her received their menus, handed over with respectful smiles and courteous nods. When it was Naomi's turn, the flight attendant handed her menu to her with a curt, almost dismissive gesture, barely making eye contact. Naomi fought back the urge to react, flipping open the menu and focusing on the selections in front of her. The options were impressive. Lobster ravioli, roasted duck, a selection of wines that would suit even the most discerning palate. Naomi chose her dish carefully, reminding herself that she was here to enjoy this journey, regardless of how others might perceive her. As she waited for the attendant to return to take her order, Naomi looked around the cabin. The other passengers appeared perfectly at ease, lost in conversations or absorbed in their own worlds. To them, this experience was routine, another comfortable journey on their path to a familiar destination. But for Naomi, who had fought for every inch of her success, this was meant to be something extraordinary, a well-earned reward. When the attendant finally returned to take her order, her expression was no warmer than before. The same cool, indifferent stare met Naomi's request for the lobster ravioli and a glass of Chardonnay. The attendant merely nodded, not bothering with any pleasantries or the small talk she had extended to other passengers. Naomi could feel her irritation simmering, but she kept her tone polite, refusing to give in to the rising frustration. The attendant moved on to the next passenger, her entire demeanor transforming. Her voice softened, her smile genuine, as she took the man's order with warmth that bordered on familiarity. Naomi watched, feeling the weight of the double standard pressing down on her. She had come too far to let something as trivial as a meal order break her composure, but each interaction seemed designed to test her patience, to remind her that, in their eyes, she didn't belong. Time passed slowly as she waited for her meal, her fingers tapping lightly on the armrest. She tried to distract herself by adjusting the lighting above her seat and skimming through the in-flight entertainment options, but nothing could fully occupy her mind. She was tired, mentally and emotionally drained from the constant barrage of subtle slights and passive hostility. Finally, the meals began to arrive. Naomi watched as the attendants moved through the cabin, serving each passenger with the care and precision expected in first class. The tantalizing aroma of freshly prepared food filled the air, drawing murmurs of approval from around her. People leaned back in their seats, satisfied smiles spreading across their faces as they took their first bites, complimenting the food in low, appreciative tones. When the attendant approached Naomi with her meal, however, there was a distinct shift in her demeanor. The usual flourish with which meals were presented seemed absent, replaced by a brusque, almost begrudging motion as she placed the plate in front of Naomi. Naomi looked down at her plate, her eyes widening in disbelief. It was a stark contrast to the artfully plated meals she had seen served to other passengers. The food on her plate looked hastily arranged, with none of the careful presentation she had expected. It was almost as though it had been thrown together without any thought or care, the dish bearing none of the elegance she had observed on the trays of others. Naomi felt a pang of anger rise within her. She looked up at the attendant, expecting to meet her gaze, but the woman had already turned away, moving on to the next row without so much as a word. It was a deliberate snub, a clear message that Naomi's presence here was tolerated, but certainly not welcomed. She sat there for a moment, staring at the plate in front of her, trying to process what had just happened. The unfairness of it gnawed at her, the injustice of being treated differently because of who she was. She thought of all the obstacles she had overcome to get here, of the sacrifices she had made, the hard work that had brought her to this moment. And now, here she was, being made to feel like an outsider in a place she had every right to be. She lifted her fork, trying to find the resolve to push past her frustration and simply eat, but her appetite was gone. The indignity of it all was too much to ignore. Every bite felt bitter, the food tainted by the disdain that had been woven into each interaction. Around her, the other passengers continued to enjoy their meals, their laughter and quiet conversations only heightening her sense of isolation. She could feel their eyes on her, subtle but unmistakable, as though they were waiting to see how she would react. They wanted her to feel uncomfortable, to shrink under their scrutiny, but she refused to give them the satisfaction. As she took a deep breath, preparing to leave her uneaten meal behind, the attendant returned, this time with an air of smugness that sent a chill down Naomi's spine. The woman placed a small dish on her tray, a condescending smile playing at the corners of her mouth. "Something special for you," she said, her tone laced with a mock sweetness that was impossible to ignore. Naomi looked down, and her stomach turned. The dish in front of her was a mockery, an insult that went beyond anything she could have imagined. The meal, if it could even be called that, was appalling, a slap in the face delivered with a smile. The attendant's eyes sparkled with a twisted satisfaction as she watched Naomi's reaction. "Enjoy," she said, her voice dripping with insincerity. Naomi's hands clenched into fists, her patience snapping like a taut wire. For hours she had endured the whispers, the stares, the dismissive gestures, all in the hope of maintaining her dignity. But this was a line crossed. This was a deliberate attempt to humiliate her, to strip her of the respect she had fought so hard to earn. Without thinking, she reached for the plate, her movements swift and decisive. Her eyes locked onto the attendant's, and with a single fluid motion she lifted the dish and threw it, her frustration and anger spilling over in a wave of defiance. The plate struck the attendant's face, its contents splattering across her uniform, leaving her stunned and speechless. The entire cabin fell silent, the shock rippling through the air like a physical force. Naomi rose to her feet, her voice steady but filled with the weight of every insult, every slight she had endured. "You have no idea who I am," she said, her voice low but powerful. "This plane, this first class is mine. I own it, and I refuse to be treated like this." The attendant's face paled, her mouth opening and closing as she struggled to find words. The other passengers sat frozen, their gazes shifting between Naomi and the woman she had just confronted, their expressions a mixture of shock and awe. Naomi didn't wait for an apology. She had already said what needed to be said, her statement a bold declaration of her worth, her right to be treated with dignity. She turned back to her seat, her heart pounding with adrenaline, her mind racing with the realization of what she had just done. But as she sat down, a sense of calm settled over her. She had stood up for herself in a way that left no room for doubt, no room for anyone to question her place in this space. And as the whispers resumed around her, she allowed herself a small, victorious smile. For the first time since she boarded, she felt at peace. Naomi sat back in her seat, her heart still pounding as she replayed the confrontation in her mind. The silence in the cabin was thick and charged, a stunned stillness that hung over the passengers like a weight. She could feel the intensity of their stares, the collective shock at what had just unfolded. But Naomi no longer cared. Her patience had worn thin, and she had finally said what she needed to say. No more quiet acceptance, no more swallowing insults and enduring the underhanded slights. She had taken a stand, and the stunned expressions around her were evidence that no one had expected it. The attendant, who had borne the brunt of her frustration, remained frozen in place, a mixture of disbelief and humiliation etched on her face. Her uniform, once pristine, was now smeared with the remnants of the meal she had so arrogantly delivered. She seemed unable to move, her hands trembling as she wiped at the stain, her eyes darting to the other passengers as if looking for support or sympathy. But the silence of the cabin held, leaving her to grapple with the weight of her actions in isolation. Naomi watched, unblinking, as the attendant struggled to regain her composure. She felt no sympathy, no remorse. For the first time since she boarded, she felt truly at ease, a deep sense of satisfaction settling over her. She had reclaimed her dignity, shown everyone in the cabin that she would not be dismissed or belittled. After a long, tense moment, the attendant finally managed to pull herself together. She turned sharply, her gaze fixed on the floor, and made a beeline toward the back of the cabin, her steps quick and unsteady. Naomi noticed that her colleagues, who had been so warm and attentive to everyone else, now seemed hesitant, unsure of how to proceed. They exchanged nervous glances, clearly rattled, and then hurriedly resumed their duties, as if hoping to dispel the tension with forced smiles and hurried movements. Around Naomi, the passengers began to murmur, their whispers barely audible but laden with curiosity and judgment. She could feel their eyes on her, the weight of their silent questions pressing down on her like a heavy blanket. But she met each gaze without flinching, her expression calm and unyielding. She was done with being polite, with blending into the background. They had wanted a reaction, and she had given them one. As she settled back into her seat, a sense of clarity washed over her. She was reminded of all the times she had endured slights and insults, all the moments when she had chosen silence over confrontation. But not tonight. Tonight, she had decided that enough was enough. And then, almost as if in response to her inner resolve, she heard the faint click of heels approaching from behind. Naomi turned her head slightly, catching sight of the flight attendant who had served her earlier. Her face was flushed, her lips pressed into a thin, tense line as she approached with deliberate, measured steps. There was no mistaking the hostility in her gaze, the barely contained anger simmering beneath her professional facade. "Is there a problem, ma'am?" the attendant asked, her voice strained. Naomi met her gaze, unblinking. "Yes," she replied evenly, her tone calm but unyielding. "I have a problem with being disrespected." The attendant's eyes flashed, but she quickly masked her reaction, adopting a neutral expression. "I apologize if there was any misunderstanding," she said, though her voice held no trace of sincerity. "However, we do have standards of conduct, and I must ask you to refrain from any further disruptions." Naomi's lips curved into a faint, humorless smile. "Disruptions?" she echoed, her voice barely above a whisper, but carrying a weight that made the attendant hesitate. "It seems to me that the only disruption here has been the lack of respect and professionalism from your staff." The attendant's face paled slightly, but she held her ground, her hands clasped tightly in front of her. "I assure you, ma'am, we value all of our passengers," she replied, though the words sounded hollow. Naomi tilted her head, regarding the woman with an air of quiet defiance. "Then I suggest you start showing it," she said, her tone firm, "because I won't be tolerating any more disrespect on this flight." The attendant's eyes flickered with a mixture of frustration and resignation. She opened her mouth as if to respond, but seemed to think better of it, her gaze dropping to the floor. After a moment's hesitation, she gave a stiff nod and turned away, retreating to the back of the cabin without another word. As she watched the woman disappear down the aisle, Naomi felt a surge of satisfaction, a sense of victory that was both liberating and empowering. She had made her stand, drawn a line that no one else would dare to cross, The silence around her was a testament to the impact of her words, a quiet acknowledgement that she had claimed her space, that she would not be moved. But as the minutes passed, Naomi began to notice a shift in the atmosphere. The attendants, once bustling about with practiced ease, now moved with a nervous, almost tentative energy, as if walking on eggshells. They glanced her way occasionally, their expressions wary and uncertain. It was clear that her actions had sent a ripple through the cabin, a silent warning that she was not someone to be trifled with. However, as the flight continued, Naomi could feel the resentment simmering beneath the surface, the collective disdain that had only grown stronger in the wake of her confrontation. She caught snippets of whispered conversations, glances filled with disapproval and judgment. She knew that many of them were watching her, waiting to see if she would lash out again, if she would prove to be the disruptive presence they had assumed her to be. And yet, she sat tall, her gaze steady as she looked out the window, watching the dark expanse of the sky stretch out before her. She was done playing by their rules, done bending herself to fit into spaces that were never meant to accommodate her. She had come too far to allow their narrow-minded judgments to diminish her. In the midst of her thoughts, a voice crackled over the intercom, announcing that the flight would soon be making a brief stop for refueling. The news seemed to catch the cabin off guard, a few murmurs rippling through the passengers as they exchanged puzzled glances. Naomi, however, remained unfazed, a subtle smile playing at the corners of her lips. As the plane began its descent, she felt a sense of calm settle over her, a quiet assurance that this was only the beginning of a reckoning. The attendants moved through the cabin, preparing the passengers for the stop, their eyes avoiding hers as they passed by. Naomi watched them with a detached amusement, noting the shift in their demeanor, the way they avoided meeting her gaze as if afraid of what they might find there. When the plane finally touched down, the hum of the engines quieted, leaving an expectant silence in its wake. Naomi remained seated, her gaze unwavering as she looked straight ahead, waiting. She could sense the tension in the air, the unspoken anticipation hanging over the cabin like a heavy shroud. And then, with a quiet but firm resolve, Naomi rose from her seat, her movements measured and deliberate. She stepped into the aisle, her presence commanding the attention of everyone around her. The attendants, noticing her approach, exchanged nervous glances, their expressions a mixture of confusion and trepidation. One of the senior attendants stepped forward, her face carefully composed. "Ma'am, may I assist you with anything?" she asked, her voice polite but tense. Naomi regarded her calmly, a slight smile touching her lips. "Yes," she replied, her tone as steady as ever. "I would like to request that certain individuals disembark from this flight before we continue." The attendant's eyes widened, a flicker of panic crossing her face. I'm sorry, ma'am, but that's highly irregular." Naomi held up a hand, silencing her with a single gesture. "I'm well aware of the procedures," she said, her voice carrying an authority that left no room for argument. "And I am exercising my right as the owner of this aircraft. There are individuals on this flight who have failed to meet the standard of respect and professionalism that I expect. They will not be joining us for the remainder of the journey." A murmur of shock spread through the cabin, passengers exchanging bewildered glances as the reality of Naomi's words began to sink in. The attendants looked at one another, uncertainty clouding their faces, but Naomi's gaze remained unwavering. "I trust that you will handle the arrangements accordingly," she added, her tone leaving no room for negotiation. The senior attendant swallowed, nodding hesitantly as she turned to her colleagues, her face pale with the weight of Naomi's command. They moved quickly. Their footsteps hurried as they began to carry out her instructions, their once confident demeanor now replaced by a nervous compliance. As the attendants moved down the aisle, Naomi took her seat once more, her gaze fixed on the window as the first rays of dawn began to break over the horizon. She felt a profound sense of relief, a quiet satisfaction that washed over her in waves, filling the emptiness left by the night's injustices. Behind her, the murmurs grew louder, a chorus of disbelief and indignation as the reality of the situation set in. But Naomi remained calm, unshaken, a faint smile playing at the corners of her mouth as she prepared to continue her journey, free from the weight of their scorn. The early morning light poured through the windows, casting a soft glow over the first-class cabin as Naomi sat back in her seat, her demeanor serene and unshaken. Around her, however, the cabin buzzed with a growing tension. The murmurs of disbelief had spread quickly, rippling through the passengers as they processed the extraordinary turn of events. Many of them cast glances her way, some angry, some bewildered, but Naomi met each look with calm confidence, her gaze unwavering. As the realization of their situation sank in, several passengers began to voice their outrage. A man seated a few rows ahead of her turned around, his expression one of disbelief. "This is outrageous," he hissed, his voice barely contained. "You can't just throw people off this flight." Naomi's gaze was steady, unyielding as she replied, "I'm afraid that's exactly what's happening." Her tone was calm, resolute, as if she were discussing a routine business decision rather than orchestrating the removal of several passengers from an international flight. The man's face turned red with indignation, his hands gripping the armrests as if struggling to contain his anger. "Who do you think you are?" he demanded, his voice carrying across the cabin. She didn't flinch, her expression calm and unperturbed. "I'm the owner of this aircraft, and I have the authority to ensure that everyone on board adheres to a standard of respect and professionalism. That includes passengers and crew alike." Her words settled over the cabin like a quiet storm, their weight undeniable. A few passengers muttered under their breath, clearly uncomfortable, but none of them dared to challenge her further. The authority in her voice, her unbreakable composure, had left them momentarily stunned. Meanwhile, the attendants moved with swift, uneasy efficiency, gathering the few individuals Naomi had specified for removal. The woman who had refused to meet Naomi's gaze earlier, the man who had muttered dismissive remarks, each of them now found themselves the center of unwanted attention as they were approached by the flight crew. Their protests were loud, their voices rising in disbelief and panic, but Naomi's resolve remained unshaken. The senior attendant approached Naomi, her face pale with nervousness. "Ma'am, we'll have to complete the disembarkation process quickly to remain on schedule." Naomi gave a brief nod, her gaze never wavering. "Then I suggest you proceed," she replied, her tone carrying the finality of a decision that had already been made. The attendant hesitated, clearly uneasy, but then turned away, gesturing to her colleagues to begin escorting the selected passengers from the cabin. As they moved down the aisle, the whispers grew louder, a mix of indignation and bewilderment filling the air. But Naomi remained unmoved, her posture regal, her expression unyielding. The disgraced passengers gathered near the front of the cabin, their faces flushed with anger and humiliation. They cast glances back at her, their expressions ranging from outrage to pleading, but Naomi met each look with the same calm indifference. She had made her decision, and there was no room for negotiation. Among them was the attendant who had been so dismissive, the one who had served her with disdain and disrespect. She looked at Naomi with an expression that wavered between fear and defiance, her hands trembling as she clutched her belongings. Naomi held her gaze, a subtle but unmistakable message in her eyes. Respect was not a privilege, but an expectation. One by one, the passengers and the attendant who had wronged her were led off the plane. The flight crew had arranged for them to disembark into the airport terminal of the unfamiliar city where they had landed for refueling. Naomi watched them go, feeling a strange sense of closure settle over her as they disappeared down the jet bridge, their protests fading into the distance. The rest of the passengers sat in stunned silence, their gazes flickering between Naomi and the empty seats left behind. Some looked fearful, others curious, but none dared to speak. They had witnessed her strength, her refusal to bow to disrespect, and though some were outraged, others seemed to regard her with a newfound respect. The senior attendant returned, her face flushed, her demeanor suddenly subdued. She approached Naomi cautiously, her expression carefully neutral. "Ma'am, we're prepared to resume the flight whenever you're ready." Naomi inclined her head slightly, her gaze never leaving the attendant's face. "Very well," she replied, her tone soft but laced with authority. The attendant gave a stiff nod, clearly relieved to be out of the spotlight, and hurried to inform the rest of the crew. As she retreated, Naomi took a moment to breathe, her mind replaying the events of the past few hours. It had been an ordeal, a journey far from the peaceful escape she had envisioned, but she had emerged from it stronger, her dignity intact. As the plane took off once more, climbing into the early morning sky, Naomi felt a sense of peace settle over her. The murmurs of the remaining passengers faded into the background, their once hostile stares now tempered with a quiet respect. She no longer felt like an outsider in this space. She had claimed her place, asserted her right to be treated with dignity, and shown them all that she would not be pushed aside. After a while, one of the remaining attendants approached, carrying a fresh glass of champagne. She was different from the others, a younger woman with kind eyes and a nervous smile. She set the glass down carefully on Naomi's tray, her voice soft as she spoke. "For you, ma'am," she said, her tone respectful, almost apologetic. Naomi looked up, meeting her gaze with a small nod of acknowledgement. She could see the nervousness in the attendant's eyes, the quiet fear that lingered in the wake of her actions, but there was also a glimmer of understanding, a recognition of the courage it had taken for Naomi to stand up for herself. "Thank you," Naomi replied, her tone gentle but firm. The attendant hesitated, her hands clasped tightly in front of her, and then, after a brief moment, she gave a small, respectful nod before retreating to the back of the cabin. Naomi took a sip of the champagne, savoring the crisp taste, the quiet satisfaction that filled her with each sip. She had reclaimed her space, her dignity, and her peace. As the flight continued, Naomi allowed herself to relax, letting go of the tension that had gripped her for so long. The sky outside the window was a soft expanse of blue, the early morning light casting a warm glow over the clouds below. For the first time since boarding, she felt truly at ease, her heart light with the knowledge that she had faced down the prejudice around her and emerged unscathed. The remaining passengers seemed to sense the shift in the atmosphere, their gazes now averted, their whispers quieted. They had witnessed her strength, her refusal to bow to disrespect, and though some may have been outraged, others seemed to regard her with a newfound respect. It was a quiet victory, a reminder that she had earned her place in this world, and that no amount of judgment or disdain could take that away from her. As the plane soared through the sky, Naomi leaned back in her seat, a faint smile playing at the corners of her mouth. She raised her glass in a silent toast to herself, to her strength, and to the journey she had taken to reach this point. She had faced their scorn, their disrespect, and their attempts to make her feel small, and she had shown them all that she was unbreakable. With a final sip of her champagne, Naomi settled into her seat, closing her eyes as she prepared for the journey ahead. She no longer felt the weight of their judgment, the sting of their disdain. She had reclaimed her power, her dignity, and her peace, and as the plane carried her closer to her destination, she knew that she had left the bitterness and pain of the past behind her. For Naomi, this journey was more than just a flight. It was a testament to her resilience, her strength, and her refusal to be defined by the narrow minds of others. And as the clouds drifted by outside her window, she felt a quiet joy, a sense of freedom that could not be taken from her. As the plane continued on its journey, Naomi felt a calm she hadn't anticipated. The turmoil of the past hours had finally settled, and with each mile that passed, she felt the weight of anger and frustration lifting, replaced by a quiet pride. She had stood up for herself, refusing to let prejudice diminish her or make her feel unworthy of the respect she deserved. This wasn't simply about a plane ride. It was about her right to take up space, to be seen and respected as an equal. Yet, as the plane moved smoothly across the sky, the silence in the cabin remained thick with tension. She could sense the discomfort of those around her, some who were angry, others who were quietly reflecting on what had just occurred. The attendants moved cautiously, their gazes downcast as they resumed their duties, the reverberation of her actions still palpable in the air. A few seats ahead, an elderly man who had observed the entire ordeal turned to glance at Naomi. His face was lined with age, his eyes soft with a wisdom that came from years of life experience. He didn't say anything, but he offered her a nod, a simple, sincere gesture that needed no words. Naomi returned the nod, a silent understanding passing between them. In that brief moment, she felt the solidarity of someone who recognized her struggle, who understood the quiet strength it took to rise above the judgment of others. As the attendants continued their rounds, Naomi noticed how their demeanor toward her had subtly shifted. They moved with a newfound respect, their expressions careful and respectful, as if acknowledging her position without the need for words. The once hostile stares from other passengers had softened, replaced by a quiet respect, perhaps even a bit of admiration. Soon, the flight captain's voice crackled over the intercom, announcing that the plane would begin its descent shortly. Naomi glanced at her watch, realizing that they were already approaching her destination. The announcement seemed to break the tension in the cabin, and the other passengers began to stir, gathering their belongings and preparing for landing. The murmur of conversation returned, but it was softer now, lacking the edge of hostility that had marked the beginning of the flight. As the plane descended through the clouds, Naomi took a deep breath, savoring the cool, crisp air that filled the cabin. She had entered this journey with the intention of finding peace, and while it had been far from the restful escape she had envisioned, she felt a profound sense of closure. She had faced down the prejudice, the judgment, and the disdain, and had emerged stronger, her dignity unbroken. The plane touched down smoothly, and Naomi felt a rush of relief as the wheels met the runway. She watched the landscape roll by through her window, the familiarity of her destination bringing a sense of comfort. This place held a special meaning for her, a reminder of her journey and the heights she had reached through hard work and determination. And as the plane taxied toward the gate, she felt a quiet triumph settle over her. When the doors finally opened, the passengers began to file out, some casting lingering glances in her direction. She met each gaze without flinching, her head held high as she gathered her belongings, moving deliberately, unhurried. The flight attendants offered her nods of acknowledgement, their expressions solemn, a quiet apology embedded in the way they stepped aside as she passed. Stepping into the terminal, Naomi was greeted by the familiar sights and sounds of her destination. She took a moment to pause, to breathe in the fresh air and let the stress of the flight melt away. This was her sanctuary, her place of peace, and she intended to savor every moment of it. But before she could take another step, she heard a voice call out behind her. Turning, she saw one of the flight attendants approaching her, a look of uncertainty on her face. She was one of the younger crew members, the one who had brought her the glass of champagne after the confrontation. "Excuse me, ma'am," the attendant said, her voice tentative. I just wanted to apologize on behalf of the crew." Naomi regarded her thoughtfully, noting the sincerity in her gaze. "Thank you," she replied, her tone gentle but firm. "I hope this experience serves as a reminder that respect is owed to everyone, regardless of appearances." The attendant nodded, her cheeks flushed with embarrassment. "Yes, ma'am. It certainly has. I'm sorry for the way you were treated." Naomi offered her a small smile, a sign of acceptance. She had made her point, and it was clear that the lesson had been received. As she turned to leave, the attendant remained rooted in place, her expression one of quiet reflection, as if still processing the weight of Naomi's words. Walking through the terminal, Naomi allowed herself a moment to unwind, to let go of the tension that had gripped her for so long. She felt lighter, freer, as if a burden had been lifted. She had faced the prejudice head-on, and though it hadn't been easy, she knew that she had left a lasting impression, a mark that would not easily be forgotten. In the days that followed, Naomi found herself reflecting on the experience with a mix of pride and resolve. She knew that prejudice and discrimination were forces that could not be easily eradicated, but she also understood the power of standing up, of refusing to accept disrespect, of demanding the dignity she deserved. It was a lesson she carried with her, a reminder of the strength that lay within her and the courage it took to assert her place in a world that sometimes refused to see her worth. As she embraced the peace and beauty of her destination, Naomi felt a sense of renewal, a reinvigoration of the purpose that had driven her all her life. She had come through the fire unscathed, her spirit unbroken, and as she looked out over the horizon, she knew that this journey was only the beginning of a greater resolve to demand respect, not just for herself, but for everyone who faced the same battles. With each step forward, Naomi carried the memories of her journey, the strength of her convictions, and the quiet joy of knowing that she had triumphed over the prejudice and judgment that sought to diminish her. She had claimed her place, her dignity, and her peace, and no one could take that away. Naomi stood on the terrace of her private villa, a gentle breeze playing with the edge of her silk robe. The sun was setting, casting hues of gold and amber across the ocean, a serene, endless horizon that seemed to embody the peace she had sought on this journey. She took a deep breath, savoring the fresh, salty air, her mind wandering back to the events of the flight. The discomfort, the quiet hostility, the pointed looks, all of it seemed like a distant memory now, a chapter that had closed, leaving her with a newfound sense of clarity and resolve. With a glass of champagne in her hand, Naomi raised it in a silent toast to herself. She had come through the experience stronger, more certain of her place in the world, unshaken by the judgments of those who had tried to diminish her. The champagne was cold, crisp, the taste a reminder of her victory, a quiet celebration of her strength. She was free here, liberated from the weight of others' opinions, their expectations, and their prejudices. This was her moment, her